All My Sons is a play by Arthur Miller that was first performed in January 1947 at the Coronet Theatre. This American realist social drama is set in the 1940s suburban American Midwest in the backyard of the Keller home in the outskirts of an American town. Miller won the Tony Award for Best Author for this play. Arthur Miller was born during a time marked by the Great Depression and the Second World War. The Second World War lifted the United States out of a long and severe economic depression. It provided jobs for millions and fueled American industry in support of the fight for democracy against fascism, led by Germany, Italy, and Japan. Miller reportedly first heard a story from his mother-in-law in Ohio about a young woman who exposed her father for swindling the military. This story reflected the wider national concern about financial corruption during wartime. After the United States entered World War II, massive funds were spent on military supplies, leading President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to appoint Missouri Senator Harry Truman to oversee their proper use. One major case involved the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Corporation in Ohio, accused in 1943 of falsifying safety tests and reports for airplane engines. Investigations revealed that some Army officials helped cover up the misconduct by dismissing honest inspectors. A general was imprisoned for his involvement. Similar scandals appeared in other industrial cities such as Cleveland, Sandusky, and Detroit, where companies knowingly provided defective materials for planes and ships. The Act 1 begins in August in the backyard of the Keller home in the outskirts of an American town. On a Sunday morning, Joe Keller, nearing 60, chats with his neighbor, Dr. Jim Bayless, nearing 40, about the weather. Soon, another neighbor, Frank Luby, 32 but balding, joins them. Keller reads the wanted ads in the Sunday newspaper and marvels that many kinds of businesses now exist. Frank notices that a tree in the yard has been broken. Keller sadly explains that it fell during the storm the night before, and his wife, Kate Keller, hasn't seen it yet. Frank recalls, the tree was planted in memory of Keller's son, Larry, who would have turned 27 that month. Frank knows Larry's birthday because he has been preparing a horoscope for him at Kate's request. She wants to find out if November 25th, the day Larry went missing in the war, was a favorable day for Larry. Frank and Kate believe that it would be practically impossible for him to have died on his favorable day, but Keller doesn't believe in such things. Keller mentions that Annie is staying upstairs. Jim, who recently moved to the neighborhood, has never met her, while Frank looks forward to seeing an old friend again. At that moment, Jim's wife, Sue Bayless, arrives to tell him that a patient is waiting on the phone and he should be glad to earn his fee. Before leaving, Sue says Annie should come by later to see the changes in her old house. After they leave, Frank's wife, Lydia Luby, enters to complain about a broken toaster, so Frank leaves. Before Lydia goes, she asks if Annie is still unmarried. Keller responds bitterly that the war is to blame. Because of it, Annie remains single and he has only one son instead of two. Keller's surviving 32-year-old son, Chris, arrives. They talk about Kate's reaction when she sees Larry's tree broken. Then, a neighborhood boy, Bert, runs in to play a make-believe game with Keller, pretending that Keller is the police inspector and that there's a jail in the basement. After Keller deputizes him, Bert happily runs off to continue his patrol. Chris reveals that he saw his mother outside by the tree that night, crying and wandering like she did after Larry's death. Larry has been missing for several years, but Kate still believes he is alive. Chris feels guilty that he and his father let her hold on to this false hope when they both know nobody believes Larry is alive anymore. However, Keller refuses to accept, saying there's no body and there's no grave to convince his wife otherwise. Then, Chris admits that he invited Annie to visit because he wants to marry her. Keller is uneasy about the idea since Annie was Larry's girlfriend, and Kate still views her as Larry's girl. From Kate's perspective, if Larry is alive, Annie can't marry anyone else. But Chris insists that Annie is the only woman he wants, though they have not seen each other since the war. He warns his father that if his parents don't approve, Annie and he will marry and move away. Keller is shocked at the thought of Chris abandoning the family business and says, "I ignore what I gotta ignore." Kate enters and views Larry's fallen tree as a sign that he's coming home. Chris uneasily tries to shift the conversation, saying that Annie looks good. Kate says she loves Annie for staying loyal and not marrying someone else after Larry went missing. She complains of a headache caused by a dream in which she saw Larry calling to her from his airplane cockpit, another proof, she believes, that he is still alive. Kate becomes angry when Chris suggests that perhaps they should move on. After Chris leaves to fetch her some aspirin, she anxiously asks Keller whether Chris plans to propose to Annie. Kate insists that Annie's continued singleness means she's been waiting for Larry, and they must not destroy that hope. She agitatedly declares that if Larry isn't coming back, she'll live herself. She also insists that Keller, of all people, must keep believing, but he doesn't understand why. At that moment, Bert re-enters, but Kate sends him away, telling them to stop playing the jail game. And in Chris's arrival interrupt the ongoing argument. Jim and Sue Bayless enter and are introduced to Anne. Before leaving, Sue warns Anne never to count her husband's money, not even in her thoughts. Then Mother remarks that Anne is staying in Larry's old room, surprising Anne when she discovers that the closet is still full of clothes and the shoes are polished. Mother pulls Anne aside and Anne clarifies that her parents aren't getting divorced. Mother inquires whether Anne still waits for Larry and says she doesn't. Mother insists that Anne must still believe Larry is alive. When Anne asks why she believes this, Mother replies that there's God, so certain things can never happen. Frank enters and asks Anne about her brother George Deaver, who is a lawyer, and about when her father expects parole. After Frank leaves, Anne is upset that the townspeople are still talking about her father, after years of his imprisonment. Keller reassures her that no one talks about it now, saying that when he was released, he walked down the street proudly with his head held high. Keller and Anne's father, Steve Deaver, were business partners during the war. They had sold cracked cylinder heads to the Air Force, which caused 21 P-40 fighter planes to crash. Both men were tried, but Steve went to prison while Keller was acquitted and returned home. And is amazed that Keller holds no grudge against her father when Steve blamed him for the crime, and hasn't spoken to her father since. Chris says that Steve is a murderer, and bitterly adds that one of those faulty parts might have been in Larry's plane. Enraged at this suggestion, Mother insists that Larry's death has nothing to do with the case. Keller defends Steve, saying he was a weak man who merely followed orders and that it was a mistake and not a murder. When Keller and Mother exit and decides to leave, but Chris convinces her to stay by confessing his love. Chris admits he finds it hard to enjoy happiness knowing that the soldiers died while he survived, and encourages him to take pride in his life and business. Keller returns, saying that George called and goes to answer the phone. Keller becomes suspicious that George, who is calling from Columbus, may be trying to reopen the case. Chris angrily denies this. Keller changes the subject, telling Chris he wants to rename the business after him. Keller accuses Chris of being ashamed of the money, insisting that it's good money, there's nothing wrong with that money, and returns with the news that George is coming that night. After she and Chris leave, Mother enters, worried that George's visit means Steve has told him something new about the case. Keller dismisses the idea, but Mother questions him twice, warning him to be careful and be smart now, Joe. The boy is coming. Be smart. Act 2 starts at the same evening, as twilight falls. Mother informs Chris she fears George's visit is meant to reopen the case. After she leaves, and tells Chris that they should soon inform his mother about their engagement. Chris steps away, and then chats with Sue Bayless. Sue complains that her husband resents her for putting him through medical school, saying, "You can never owe somebody without resenting them." She adds that Jim wants to do medical research, and blames Chris for inspiring him with idealistic dreams of helping humanity. Sue claims that Chris makes other men feel guilty about their comfortable lives while living off his father's business, which, she hints, was built on dirty money. Chris enters, and Sue politely greets him before leaving, and tells Chris that Sue dislikes him and that many people in town think Keller is guilty. Chris is offended, saying he could never forgive his father if he believed that. Keller joins them, remarks that everyone is getting so educated these days that soon there will be no one left to do ordinary work, everybody's getting so educated in this country there will be nobody to take away the garbage. You stand on the street today and spit, you're gonna hit a college man. Changing the subject, Keller offers to give Anne's father a job after his release, claiming it would keep Steve from being a burden on the newlyweds. And firmly refuses, saying she would never have anything to do with her father again. Keller takes offense and leaves. George enters, and after some awkward small talk, he directly tells Anne that she can't marry Chris because Keller destroyed their family. George visited their father in prison to tell him about the engagement and discovered that they had been wrong to cut him off. Steve had been alone when the cracked cylinder heads arrived at the factory. He called Keller for advice, and Keller told him to weld the cracks and send the parts to the army. Steve didn't want to take responsibility alone, but Keller claimed to have the flu, so he stayed home, giving himself an excuse later to deny involvement. Chris says he's heard this story in court before, but George insists that hearing it from his frightened father made him realize Steve couldn't have acted alone. Chris argues that his father, being a frightened mouse, would have blamed Keller to save himself. George accuses Chris of knowing the truth and hiding it, which is why his name isn't on the business. Mother enters and warmly greets George. Lydia stops by, which makes George wistful. George says his father is unwell, and Keller reacts with friendly sympathy, which makes it hard for George to stay angry. Keller reminds him of times when Steve blamed others for his own mistakes, and George admits that's true. His anger fades, and he agrees to stay for dinner. Everyone seems relaxed again until Mother proudly declares that Keller hasn't been laid up in 15 years. Keller adds, "Except my flu during the war," realizing too late that he has brought up the lie from the trial. The room falls silent as Mother catches the slip and George grows suspicious again. Frank enters with Larry's horoscope, declaring that Larry disappeared on a favorable day, so he couldn't have died then. Mother seizes on this, insisting that Larry is alive. She tells and she has packed her bag and it's time to go. George tries to convince and to leave, but she refuses until Chris tells her to. Chris loses his temper and throws George out, and follows to calm him. Now alone, Chris confronts his mother for packing Anne's bag. Mother insists that everyone must keep waiting for Larry. Chris says that Larry is gone, but Mother screams that Larry is alive, because if he isn't, then Keller is a murderer. As long as you live, that boy is alive. God does not let a son be killed by his father. Chris realizes the truth. Keller admits he ordered the shipment to go out but insists it was a business decision, not a crime. He says he thought the army would notice the cracks. Chris is horrified that his father suspected the planes might crash and still went ahead. Keller says he did it all for Chris. But Chris, devastated, says his father killed 21 men and calls him a murderer. He breaks down, accusing Keller of thinking only about money, not human lives, and then stumbles away in tears while Keller cries after him. Act 3 begins at 2 o'clock the following morning. Mother sits outside in a rocking chair, waiting for Chris to come home. Jim comes by and asks about the argument. He admits he has known the truth about Keller and Steve for a long time ago. Mother says she thought Chris almost knew and didn't realize how hard the truth would be such a shock. Jim says that Chris will come back, he needs time to face the loss of his ideals. Jim once left his wife to do medical research but came back because he's a good husband. Likewise, Chris will return because he's a good son. Then Jim leaves. Keller enters and Mother tells him that when Chris comes back, Keller must face him honestly. Keller should show that he understands the seriousness of what he did and offer to go to prison if Chris asks him to. Keller refuses and insists that he made that decision to protect his wife and son. He admits he spoiled his family instead of teaching them to earn their way. Mother reminds him that none of this excuses his crime. Keller argues that nothing is more important than family. Mother replies that Chris believes there are higher moral values beyond family. Keller stubbornly says Chris will forgive him because he's my son. Because I'm his father and he's my son. Nothing's bigger than that. I'm his father and he's my son, and if there's something bigger than that I'll put a bullet in my head. Keller adds that Larry would have understood him because Larry understood business. And enters and tells Mother that his parents made Chris feel guilty for loving her. The only way for them to be happy is for Mother to admit that Larry is dead and to stop pretending otherwise. You had 2 sons. But you've only got 1 now. Mother refuses, insisting that Larry is alive and that Chris and know it too. And replies that she knows Larry is dead, otherwise, she could never have loved another man. Would I have looked at anyone else if I wasn't sure? And takes out a letter from her pocket, a letter from Larry that she had kept secret. She never wanted to show it unless absolutely necessary, but Mother's denial has left her no choice. Larry wrote it just before he disappeared. Mother reads the letter and moans in pain, and explains that she had to show it to make Mother believe the truth. Chris returns and announces he plans to leave town. He can't stay and live with the knowledge of his father's guilt. If he were still the idealist he once was, he would have Keller jailed, but now he's practical, like everyone else. And offers to go with him, but he refuses, saying that she would always want him to punish his father. And urges him to do what's right, but Chris says sending Keller to prison won't bring the dead men back. Keller comes in, trying to talk to Chris, but Chris walks away. Keller asks if too much money bothers him, then Chris can give it away or do whatever he wants with it. Chris replies that the question is what Keller will do. Keller insists he doesn't belong in prison, arguing that no one worked for free during the war as everyone profited. Chris says he once believed his father was better than other men, but now he can't even look at him, and gives Chris the letter despite Mother's desperate attempts to stop her. Chris reads it aloud. In the letter, written on the day he disappeared, Larry says he had read about his father's crime and the crashed planes. Overcome with guilt, he writes that he can't face anyone again. He says he is going out on a mission and will be reported missing, implying that he plans to take his own life. He ends the letter telling and he loves her but that she must not wait for him. Keller asks for the car and says he will go upstairs to get his jacket. Mother tries to stop him, saying that Larry wouldn't have wanted him to go to jail. But Keller says Larry's letter is sending him there. Keller realized that all the pilots who died were like his own children. He goes upstairs. Mother turns to Chris and begs him not to take Keller to jail. Chris says nobody can stop him now. Mother cries that the war is over and the past should stay buried. Chris answers that Keller's guilt can't be erased by pity. A gunshot is heard from inside the house. Chris runs in, then comes out in tears, calling for and to get the doctor. Mother remains outside, moaning Keller's name. Chris, weeping, says, "Mother, I didn't mean to." But she interrupts, telling him not to take the blame for his father's death. "Don't, dear. Don't take it on yourself. Forget now." Live. Let's thematically analyze Miller's All My Sons. Wartime unsettled the old structures of domestic life, taking fathers and sons to battlefields and forcing new loyalties to form among soldiers like Chris and Larry. The Kellers' unity begins to crumble when they are forced to face the truth of Joe's guilt and Chris's blind devotion to him. The Deaver family parallels this collapse, and George have turned away from their father, Steve, now imprisoned for his role in the crime. Fathers, once protectors and moral anchors, have become the sources of shame and confusion. The maternal ideal falters in Kate Keller, whose denial of Larry's death is an act of love and self-delusion. The title All My Sons begins by invoking Joe Keller's authority as patriarch, but by the end, it turns against him with tragic irony. Every decision Joe makes springs from the desire to protect his family and secure their future. But this same impulse, the need to put his family's welfare above all else, becomes his undoing. When faced with the choice of halting production or shipping cracked engine heads, Joe chooses deception, believing he is safeguarding his business and ensuring prosperity for Chris. In reality, he sacrifices integrity for comfort, and the cost proves unbearable. Larry's battle death is revealed to be self-destruction, driven by his horror at his father's corruption and his inability to live with the knowledge that other pilots had died because of Joe's actions. Kate, clinging to denial, refuses to accept Larry's death because doing so would mean admitting Joe's guilt. Chris, upon learning the truth, cannot bring himself to expose his father to the law, but he decides to leave. Having destroyed the very family he sought to protect, Joe takes his own life. Joe realizes too late that his moral responsibility extended beyond his immediate family. The pilots who died because of him were also his sons. By privileging his own bloodline over humanity, he betrayed both. Joe Keller had defined himself as a successful provider, the steadfast head of a post-war American family. But his identity collapses under the weight of his moral blindness. Keller cries. And he does, because there is something bigger, the realization that Larry, and all the fallen pilots, were his sons too. The play explores the pursuit of personal gain at the expense of moral duty that leads to ruin and the collapse of family bonds. Joe Keller represents the conflict between personal ambition and social conscience, facing the devastating consequences of his unethical choices. The title captures Joe's final realization that his moral duty reaches beyond his own household, to the 21 pilots who died because of his greed. By selling defective airplane parts during World War II, Joe caused the deaths of those soldiers and indirectly, that of his own son, Larry. These pilots become all his sons, representing the universal responsibility Joe failed to uphold. Joe's struggle lies in his refusal to confront his guilt. At first, he denies wrongdoing, then admits only to a practical error, never grasping the moral weight of his actions. He convinces himself that the faulty engines would never be used and lets his partner, Steve, take the blame. After his release, Joe lies to his wife and son, clinging to self-deception. Only when Larry's letter is read aloud, revealing that Larry took his own life out of shame for his father's crime, does Joe finally face the truth. Joe's unalivement becomes his last act of acknowledgement and acceptance of his guilt. Miller uses Joe's downfall to expose the moral dangers of capitalism, a system driven by profit, competition, and consumption. Joe's obsession with success blinds him to human cost. Dr. Jim Bayless feels trapped by money, unable to pursue research work. Sue Bayless resents Chris Keller's idealism because it threatens her financial comfort. Miller portrays a society that measures worth by material gain rather than ethical conviction. Chris Keller, once idealistic, represents the conscience of the play. He calls for a recognition of moral responsibility beyond the family circle, insisting that ignoring such duty renders Larry's sacrifice meaningless. When he discovers his father's crime, he is determined to reject Joe's narrow values. His challenge to his father, "Don't you live in the world?" is an accusation and a plea for awareness, urging him to see life as shared and collective, not self-serving. The play ends with Joe's self-destruction and Kate's plea to her surviving son, Live. Her words carry sorrow and hope, an appeal for Chris not to inherit Joe's guilt, but to move forward, embracing a life of moral clarity. At first, everyone except Annie believes that Larry's death was accidental, that he died honorably in battle. But Annie reveals the truth that Larry took his own life after discovering his father's and Steve's guilt in the manufacturing scandal. He didn't wait for the trial's verdict because in his mind, both men were already condemned. Rather than return home burdened by this knowledge, Larry chose death over disillusionment. George once trusted Joe's story and accepted the court's verdict that his own father, Steve, was guilty, now begins to doubt when he visits Steve in prison. His doubts unsettle the fragile peace between the two families. He forces Chris to confront a question he has long avoided, whether his father truly bears responsibility for the pilot's deaths. After the war, Chris joined his father's business and was set to inherit it, but he always felt a vague unease about its moral foundation. He had buried his suspicions, and his survivor's guilt, beneath comfort and loyalty. But when Joe's guilt is laid bare, Chris's moral world shatters. He condemns his father for the 21 dead pilots and corrupting his own conscience and leaving him unable to act justly. Meanwhile, Kate accepts Joe's involvement in the shipment of defective parts but refuses to accept Larry's death. Joe does the opposite as he admits Larry is gone but denies his own guilt. Their marriage, and indeed their household, rests on this mutual self-deception. Kate's repeated attempts of sending Annie packing stems from Annie's affection for Chris and the fear that Annie carries her imprisoned father's judgment into their home. Joe Keller's moral failure is the engine of the play. He justifies sending out the defective parts by blaming wartime pressures, business necessity, and the Army's negligence. He refuses to take responsibility until the end, when Annie's revelation of Larry's self-destruction forces him to confront the full scope of his wrongdoing. Joe finally sees that, in a moral sense, he did kill his own son. The realization drives him to take his own life, a final, desperate act of accountability. Joe's unalivement closes the circle of guilt. He dies for the 21 pilots, Steve, Larry's death, and his own moral blindness. His money, and the comfort it brought, are permanently stained by blood. In the end, Kate urges Chris and Annie to leave, to escape the poisoned legacy of their parents' generation. Her clarity in this final moment suggests that renewal is possible, but only through departure. The play ends on fragile hope, as Chris and Annie stand at the threshold of a new beginning, free, at last, from the sins of their fathers. Let's discuss important symbols of All My Sons by Arthur Miller. The play opens in the Keller's backyard, a confined, claustrophobic space surrounded by tall, closely planted poplars which lend the yard a secluded atmosphere. This setting creates the illusion of a family separated from the rest of the world. The fallen memorial tree immediately signals that this harmony is fragile. The tree, planted in memory of Larry after the war, represents his life and the family's inability to let go of his memory. Kate refuses to accept that Larry is dead, but the broken tree suggests the truth she refuses to face. The destruction of the tree occurs in August, the month of Larry's birth, and on the day of Anne's visit, an event that reopens the family's buried guilt. For Kate, the tree's fall is a sign that others have given up hope and forgotten him. Chris later removes the broken tree, but its meaning lingers over the play like a shadow. Act 2 opens with Chris sawing the remaining trunk, leaving only a stump, a visible reminder of the family's emotional damage. When George arrives, he remarks that the trees have grown thick, a metaphor for the tangled web of delusions surrounding the Keller's guilt. Arthur Miller makes the tree an apple tree, referencing the biblical Garden of Eden. The Keller's backyard becomes a modern Eden, where innocence, sin, and guilt are debated. As Adam and Eve's act of eating the forbidden fruit brought about humanity's fall, the fall of Larry's tree parallels the family's moral downfall. The destroyed tree marks the beginning of revelation and the end of denial, the moment when truth begins to replace illusion. The conflict of All My Sons arises from the production of faulty airplane cylinder heads during World War II. The Keller family's prosperity, reflected in their comfortable suburban home, rests on a foundation of moral corruption. Joe Keller knowingly allowed defective parts to be shipped to the Air Force to keep his business running, a decision that led to the deaths of 21 pilots. These cylinder heads literally are the heads of the engines, but metaphorically, they represent the heads of families, the men whose moral and ethical failures cause destruction. As damaged mechanical parts cause fatal crashes, the flawed moral codes of the Kellers cause the collapse of their families. Each family member functions like a warped component in a machine driven by greed and denial. Joe justifies his decision by calling it a business necessity. Chris condemns him for valuing profit over human life. The exchange between them, kids were hanging in the air by those heads. You Knew That lays bare the play's moral conflict. Airplanes, once symbols of human progress and wartime heroism, become in Miller's play symbols of the darker consequences of the American dream, the way capitalism and moral compromise can turn innovation into tragedy. The planes that fell from the sky parallel the fall of the Keller family, brought down by their moral failures. The German word Keller literally means cellar, so the imagined jail beneath the Keller home represents the hidden guilt at the foundation of Joe's life. Beneath his respectable facade lies the truth he tries to bury, his crime, lies, and moral imprisonment. Joe's make-believe game with Bert angers Kate, who can't bear to see this unspoken guilt brought to the surface. Her reaction reveals her constant fear that the family's secret will be exposed. Joe's arresting gun in the game foreshadows the real gunshot that ends the play, turning the childish game into a grim reality. Steve Deaver, Joe's former partner, is literally in jail, taking the blame for the defective parts. Joe was imprisoned but later acquitted, though his moral guilt remains. When his crime finally comes to light, Kate and Chris tell him that he belongs in jail, acknowledging that justice can't be escaped. Joe's self-destruction becomes his way of carrying out his own sentence, enacting the punishment he could not face through the law. Do like and comment.